So I gave, or was part of 2 presentations today. The first one was with Warner Brothers and Starcom, where we were presenting some very interesting data on product integrations in show. So we had the Ellen DeGeneres show and then the Bonnie Hunt show, and then used biometric measures, unconscious measures of emotional response, moment by moment, to develop a set of best practices. And the big takeaways were sort of the do's and don'ts for companies and creatives who are thinking about this kind of work. And I think one of the most exciting things about the presentation for me was, one, Warner Brothers was actually interpreting our data and presenting our data, and I got to just sort of sit there and watch, which was fantastic. And number 2, we had a creative in the room, someone who's actually making these decisions, and he was willing to get up and talk about how, you know what, this actually helped us. It helped us make better decisions, and I think that's terrific, because that's where the industry really has to go. So some of the best practices we learned were, in order to get engagement up, in other words, some of the do's, are make sure you're not directly making a marketing message. So audiences are smart, and when they feel like they're being sold to, engagement drop. So make your marketing message part of the story. It's called an integration for a reason. You want to integrate that message with what you're doing creatively. Another example is try to avoid highly technical language. So in the Bonnie Hunt example for Walgreens, they were having a demonstration of a mobile health clinic. And we're using terms like phlebotomist and bone density. And these were very technical terms for an audience. Why not talk about someone who draws blood, or a measure to look at your bones over time to avoid fractures? And that actually leads to one of the third big takeaways in terms of do's and don'ts, which is focus on benefits and not features. So position things in terms of what it can do for your audience, and your audience will be more engaged. And I think what was really exciting about all the work we did was that there were some ROI indicators, right? Everyone's interested in what kinds of return on investment we can get. And for example, in the Bonnie Hunt show, where they did an integration at Walgreens, and they talked about a mug that actually you can put a photograph on and text, they put up a phone number on their website and expected a certain number of calls and orders, and they got 5 times what they expected, showing that, you know, emotions really do drive behaviors. So in terms of the first position in a pod and the tune-out data we've been hearing about, I absolutely agree that that ad has both the most opportunity and the most threat, right? So the opportunity is to really create a moment of engagement that can hold your audience through other advertising pods, which at the end of the day is the goal of commercial television. And of course the risk is that's the first place people are going to start to tune out. We have data that clearly shows that where the level of engagement coming out of the show is directly impacts that first ad, and then over and above that, the creative of that first ad will also generate its own levels. So for example, our work with Turner that we presented at the ARF Rethink conference earlier, which was TV in context. Here we took and looked at the contextual elements of the Turner film library and then tagged certain film episodes and moments for contextual relevance, and then put in that first position advertising that match. So for example, car crash in The Bourne Supremacy, go to GM OnStar. Create a need state, solve that need state. For example, sitting around in a coffee shop, having some coffee, go to Folgers ad, generate need state, fulfill that need state. What we saw was a 20% increase in engagement in that first position. So there are definitely ways that we can think and be thoughtful about how to increase engagement when it's a critical time for networks. So one of the questions that often emerges, which is, what is the relationship between more rational messages versus more emotional messages? So part of the Warner Brothers Walgreens presentation, you could argue, had examples of both. On the one hand, we had a lighthearted tone, Ellen DeGeneres talking about a mug that has a photograph on it, and what you can do and how you can use that, and how engaging that might be for the audience. On the other hand, you had a very serious tone, which is, again, Walgreens, but this time with a health van that goes around and helps people diagnose serious things like diabetes and high blood pressure and bone density problems. How do you balance those? Well, what we saw were very high levels of engagement for both. And what we learned were that there were also very low engagements for both. But on balance, the Ellen DeGeneres was able to maintain high levels of engagement. And the way she did that was making it humorous and entertaining and relatable. Clearly, during the more serious toned Walgreens integration, there were low points when the audience got confused. But there were also very high points when the benefits were emphasized. We can help diagnose your problem and get you the care you need sooner. And that led to an increase in engagement. So what we know about the brain is that the emotions and cognitions are kind of a seesaw. And clearly, they're always trading off each other. And when we hear a rational message that resonates with us, we can generate a strong emotional response that keeps us tuned in for more information. And so what we see with our measure is, over time, how do you tune in and optimize moments that will, on balance, lead to the kinds of guides and practices to make better decisions. So the second presentation was a panel discussion led by David Poltrak of CBS, and we had 4 neuromarketing firms, so NeuroFocus, Sands Research, NeuroInsight, and Innerscope. And it was an opportunity for us all to get up there and talk about how the industry is evolving and how things are changing. And we discussed the differences between brain waves and other biologically based measures. And we talked about how these kinds of tools can inform business decisions in a new way. And the one thing all these companies agree on is that traditional measures are tapping the conscious, and the new neuroscience-based measures are tapping the unconscious. And if you just consider the simple fact that whatever the ratios are, there's clearly some processing going on an unconscious level, not having some tools to understand what's going on there is going to limit our ability to create insights in an evolving media landscape where there are more and more channels, more and more competition for the hearts and minds of our consumers, and more thoughtfulness needs to go into every communication. So where we disagree is where sensors should be placed. I mean, at the end of the day, we're all measuring the brain. Even a self-report survey is essentially tapping into language structures and memory structures of the brain. What the EEG-based companies are arguing is that closer is better. And what Innerscope is arguing is that no, a focus on emotional response is better, and that you can't get to the deep structures of the brain outside of doing actual neurosurgery or sticking people in an fMRI machine, which is very expensive on the one hand, a little bit bloody on the other. But what can we do that's scalable but still gets at the relevant question, which is that emotions drive behavior? And I think it's very hard and very controversial to say that you can measure emotions using scalp electrodes, number one. Number two, I wonder about an industry where different EEG companies can't agree on how many sensors you need, where to put them, and whether they should be wet or dry, and ultimately what they're measuring. The sensors that Innerscope uses have been around for decades and have been the foundation of emotional response dating back to William James. What's changed is the form factor. We can collect 4 channels at a time and use Bluetooth and send it to a laptop and aggregate those signals very quickly. What's changed is computer processing. We can do fancy signal processing that allows us to come to insight sooner. And what's changed is our neuroscience understanding of the brain. We now know what structures of the brain, and they're very deep and they're very tied into emotional responses, are active when heart rate's changing or skin sweat's changing, or people change their breathing rate, or they lean in during an engaging moment of programming. And that's why Innerscope measures those 4 channels. And that's why we're focused on emotion, number one. Number two, I think what got missed on the panel today was validation. and how companies get validated. And we're very proud we're the only neuromarketing firm to go through an ARF review. It's an 8-month process. We opened up our books, we showed our validation, reliability, construct validity, and predictability, which is the cornerstone of any measurement system. And we challenge all companies to do the same. One of the big questions that come up is, what is the additional information you're getting with unconscious measures relative to traditional measures like memory, brand awareness, purchase intent, motivation? And it's a great question. And what we see over and over again is that there's a higher sensitivity with the biologically based signals. So when there's a tie in the self-report measures, we usually break that tie, number one. Number two, we've seen over and over again a kind of positive bias in self-report. None of our clients ever says, wow, you know what, we thought that ad was going to tank and it went in there and really, really rocked it, right? They say the opposite. Well, the copy testing said it was going to do well and it went in market and it didn't do well. And so that suggests to me that there is a certain bias, and we see it in our data, which is there are themes that are universally appealing, that you're supposed to like, that people will fill out a form and say they like, and that, of course I'm going to buy it, of course I'm going to do this. And that's a perfectly rational conclusion, but it doesn't mean that it connected with them on that deeper emotional level. And that when it goes into market, it either can't break through the clutter or doesn't move that audience to the next step in the purchase funnel or path to purchase, which is going to be the behavior that makes them either seek out new information or go and purchase things. So that's number one. Number two, what's really interesting that I think is when we can take our data and help people reinterpret their data, whether it's a long survey or a focus group, and say, look, here's the kind of things we're seeing, and wow, you know what, we should really think about these questions differently in that context. And I think that's when everybody wins, and 1 + 1 can equal 3. The question emerges, how are big companies going to reallocate their limited resources, their budgets, given new tools of neuroscience and social media and the types of listening that I think people are starting to advocate are really important in order to make decisions in a cluttered world. Right? No longer can you just go out and blast the airwaves and use your copy testing and tracking and get the ROI you're used to getting. The world's changed, and it continues to change. So what we're seeing already is that companies are beginning to shift the mix. And there are two big implications of that. One is they're using Innerscope and the neuro-marketing measures earlier in the process. So at the concept level and the animatic level, where everybody's incentive is lined up and the insights have the most impact down the road, number one. And then number two, we're starting to see a shift in the mix. Companies have told us, you know what, we love what you do, we love what we used to do, but we can't afford both. How do we reconcile that? And the answer is evolving, and part of what we're seeing is, well, we'll use the neuroscience stuff at this stage, and then we'll use the copy at the earlier stage and the copy testing at the late stage. And then we'll use the neuroscience stuff, it's a really big campaign. And I think the other thing that's happening is there's requests to simplify some of those traditional measures and reports. The questionnaires have gotten bloated. They're too long, and they are too hard to interpret. And so if you can boil that ocean down and create a shorter survey, then you can actually lower the cost of the traditional measures, which, let's be honest, have become a commodity anyway. So let's continue to commoditize the commodity and then expand where innovation is taking us in new directions.